everybody, welcome to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Tonight we're going to be talking about the pandemic that everybody has been silent on really for the last 30 plus years globally, but especially in the United States and in other major industrialized countries. And that global pandemic that I'm referring to is not SARS-CoV, it's not COVID-19, it's not the Chinese virus, it's cancer. Cancer is the biggest, one of the most deadly human diseases that has basically largely been ignored. At least causal has been ignored for cancer. In essence, what most of the time happens is the diagnosis happens. People are then radiated, they have tumors removed or operated on. Oftentimes they get very, very dangerous chemotherapeutic drugs. But as far as finding root cause resolution, there are a lot of great researchers that have identified causation behind cancer. But the vast majority of our cancer treatment centers across the globe completely ignore these factors and allow for the death of, just in the US alone, about 1 million people every year die from this raging disease. So I want to talk in some depth tonight about cancer and especially about how gluten can actually contribute to cancer. So let's talk about a couple of components, because I posted this article. I really dove into the research on the relationship between gluten and cancer, and it's amazing how much research there actually is drawing causation behind gluten sensitivity contributing to cancer, but even beyond that, grains specifically. And I caught a lot of negative feedback from people talking about how wonderful whole grains are. So stay with me to the very end. I'm going to talk about even how whole grains can actually contribute to cancer, especially for those of you who don't understand this connection or haven't learned about this connection. Very, very important, and I want to talk with you about it tonight. So we're going to dive in first to gluten and cancer. What we're looking at here are a couple of research studies, and what I want to point out, we can kind of blow this up a little bit, but conclusion down here, I'm going to read you the conclusion of this. This is a major research study published in Biomed Central. Conclusion: celiac patients have an increased risk of developing cancer in relationship to the age of diagnosis of celiac disease. This risk results in higher malignancies in the gastrointestinal sites. So let's talk about what that really is saying. I want you to understand what this research is actually saying, is that the later or the longer it takes for a person who is gluten sensitive to get a diagnosis, to find out whether or not gluten is creating the problem. In essence, the longer in their life that takes. So maybe you were diagnosed when you were a kid. If you were, you went gluten-free, fantastic. That pretty much can mitigate your cancer risk as it relates to gluten induction of cancer. But if you got a diagnosis when you were in your 40s or in your 50s, you have to understand that the longer it takes in your life to get that diagnosis, the greater risk for you to develop cancers. What this study is showing, that cancers that you develop, the greater the risk in the gastrointestinal area. So that's what that's referring to right there in the GI tract. This other research study, malignancy and celiac disease effect of a gluten-free diet, what we've got, you can see down here, that the risk is increased, however, in those taking a reduced gluten or a normal diet with an excess of cancers, had an excess amount of cancers of the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, so your mouth, your throat, your esophagus, and also of intestinal lymphoma. So again, I want to point out, this study looked at two different groups, actually three different groups of people. The study looked at one group of people who found out they had celiac disease and went on a strict criteria gluten-free diet. The other two groups, one was a low gluten diet group and the other was we're not going gluten-free, we're going to do what we want. Well, in the two groups that didn't fully go gluten-free, again, what we're seeing here is an increased risk of cancers of the mouth, pharynx, esophagus. Okay, and so these R stands for relative risk increase. So you can see here that the relative risk, the increase of risk was 22.7% for the development of cancer. But when it came to lymphoma, the increased relative risk was almost 80%, 77.8% increase in risk. So a significant decreasing trend in the excess morbidity rate over increasing use of a gluten-free diet was found, meaning the more gluten-free a person was, the less risk for the development of those cancers they were over their lifetime. So again, two major studies pointing out that the first one, the earlier the onset of diagnosis of figuring out that you need to go gluten-free, the lower the risk. The later, the higher the risk. And then, of course, in this study showing individuals that were gluten sensitive and dividing them up into groups of people who were willing to go gluten-free and people who were not willing to go gluten-free, finding greater risk in those who didn't actually adhere to a gluten-free diet. And much greater risk, as I showed you, lymphoma increased almost 80%, the relative risk increase. Another study recently published, association between celiac disease and cancer. So what you can see here is, however, failure to adhere to a strict gluten-free diet bears the risk of adverse events and increases mortality. A considerable number of studies have considered the possible association between celiac disease and neoplasms. Neoplasms is just a fancy way of saying cancer. In particular, an increased risk of malignancies. Let's back that up. Malignancies such as cancers of the GI tract, intestinal lymphoma has been reported. This is a review of studies. So anytime we look at a review, it's a review is a research article that's published that reviews multiple different studies and weighs the quantity of evidence to show is there a relationship or is there not a relationship, and then they give their summary, which is what this says, is that we summarize and discuss the evidence of the association between celiac disease and cancer. Now, here's what that evidence says. So this diagram is directly coming from this review, and so what I'm giving you and showing you here is kind of a summary. So the things in red, so as we look at this, the things listed in red here with the red background, I'm putting a little green dash by them all. These are all studies that show those not following a gluten-free diet who needed to had an increased risk of development of these different types of cancer. So large intestine, colon, esophagus, multiple studies on esophageal cancer. And you can see here, multiple studies on thyroid cancer. You've got papillary thyroid, you've got regular thyroid cancer, pancreatic cancer, melanoma, which is a form of skin cancer, oropharyngeal hepatobiliary cancer, which is, again, liver cancer, gastric cancer, liver cancer. So all these research studies have been done showing an increased risk for the development of these types of cancers in people who were gluten sensitive. Again, not adhering, the key here is not adhering to the gluten-free diet. So let's blow up this diagram for you. What you're seeing here is kind of a summation of what the research says on gluten and increasing the risk and the different types of cancers that are increased. So again, increased cancer risk for those with gluten sensitivity of the mouth, the esophagus, the throat, the stomach, the intestinal lymphomas, colon cancer, rectal cancer, the thyroid gland, the liver, the pancreas, and the skin. Okay, now what's very important to understand here is that cancer risks were negated following a strict gluten-free diet. So these studies show that even though you are at greater risk for developing cancer from gluten, from consumption of gluten, these risks were negated following a strict gluten-free diet. This is really where the power's at, right? Because the power's in you. If you follow the diet, so diet change, meaning if we're trying to mitigate our risk, some people would say, well, what's the point? I have celiac disease. If I have an increased risk of cancer, who cares? I'm not going to do anything different with my diet. But what I want you to understand and take away is that if you change your diet, if you adhere to a strict gluten-free diet, these risks are actually mitigated. They actually go away. And now, that doesn't mean you can't get cancer, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other risk factors associated with the development of cancer. However, you mitigate your gluten-related risk for developing cancer. And I think that's the important takeaway, is that you have the power to change your diet. When we're looking at a disease that kills 1 million people a year, just in the U.S. alone, you want to have every power that you can over that as well. Next, I want to talk a little bit about, actually, let's pull up, let's see, I'm missing a slide here. Do we have, I wanted to show back that I went too far here. Let's pull this up. As it's loading here, here we go. So we're going to pull up another slide row for you. All righty.
You looking for the cancer
I am, yeah. I'm looking
at the very beginning.
It's at the very beginning. Okay, so I must have just jumped right over it. I got too excited, folks. Talking about, here we go.
Yeah.
Okay, I just missed it. So, in talking, I was saying earlier, cancer kills 1 million people a year. We're talking; these are U.S. statistics. So again, what I'm trying to give you is some sense of hope around cancer. If you've ever experienced somebody in your family, if you've known anybody who's ever gone through cancer, you know how devastating it can actually be. It's the real deal. It's a very, very serious illness that can affect people. And so 1.5 million diagnoses just in the United States alone. So 1.5 million people diagnosed with cancer every year in the U.S. 40% of you, okay, both men and women, will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. These are statistics coming from major research studies. It's the second leading cause of death. Some would actually argue that it alternates between the first and the second, and it's not really the second, because cancer and heart disease each kill about 1 million people a year. And so sometimes some years cancer overrides heart disease a little bit, and some years heart disease overrides cancer a little bit. So, and again, depending on the statistics that you read, but it's between the first and second leading cause of death a year, with about 1 million deaths. Think about this: 1,600 people die from cancer every day. And this is actually a very conservative statistic. The numbers are actually, according to some research, much higher even than this. But you think about that: 1,600 people die daily from this disease, and half of all cancers could be prevented. And this has been very well documented. Half of all cancers can be prevented with choice. And so what is that choice? That's diet change, right? Which is what we're talking about here. It's why, it's such an important component that if you are a gluten-sensitive individual, diet, lifestyle, alcohol, exercise, activity, tobacco use, what you choose to eat, what you choose not to eat, whether or not you get sunshine, the stress level that you subject yourself to. These are all choices, right? These are all things that we do on a daily basis. And so if half of all cancers could be prevented through this, then why, this is really the big question. Research. Why, if the research shows this, why do the hospitals downplay it? As a matter of fact, how many of you have been to a hospital where you got a diagnosis of cancer, knew somebody with a diagnosis of cancer, and the hospital referred you to a nutritional department or to a functional medicine department and said, hey, because we understand and appreciate and know that the research says that half of all cancers can be prevented with your choices, so we want you to have some consultation, right, with people who understand nutrition, people who understand lifestyle medicine. How many of you, again, with the experience of cancer, how many of you have ever been to a hospital where that was the standard of care, where you were sent over to a wing of the hospital where you were consulted on nutrition, diet change, exercise, lifestyle change? Raise your hand, speak up. If you're there, just chime in. Now, how many of you on the opposite end of that? So if you've had that happen where you were in a hospital-based setting and they did refer you to nutrition, just type in nutrition in the feed here. Now, if you were in the hospital setting with cancer or taking care of somebody with cancer and your doctors basically told you to eat as much ice cream and soda and just keep your calories up so that the chemo didn't waste you too much, how many of you were not told anything at all about nutrition, or told that nutrition wasn't really all that important? And if you were told nutrition was not important, just type no nutrition in the box. I'd just like to get a poll to see how many of you actually were led down this. Because again, these aren't my numbers, folks. These are numbers. This is actually the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine published these numbers. That's where these numbers are coming from. You can see approximately 40% of men and women in the United States will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lives. Half of all these cancers could be prevented because they're choice-based, right? Now, there are cancers that, certainly there are factors around cancer that we don't understand 100%. There are a number of things that we absolutely understand. And we know, for example, genetically modified foods, we know that sugar, we know that processed foods, we know that processed MSG, monosodium glutamate, among other things. We know that a lot of factors around diet. We know lack of sunshine, lack of vitamin D can cause 19 different forms of cancer. How many of you with a diagnosis of cancer were ever told, get outside, go get some sunshine? Most people are told, hey, don't get sunshine when you're going through chemo because your body can't handle all the radiation. So you're being told to avoid behaviors that are actually cancer preventative in an effort to take on more poison, because your doctors are trying to race killing the cancer with poison instead of giving you intelligent lifestyle factors and changes to make, which, your body can beat cancer. You should know that. Your body can win against cancer, but it can't win if it doesn't have the tools that are necessary. What does your body need to beat cancer? It needs good nutrition. It needs love. It needs a supportive environment. Your body needs sleep. It needs an adequate sleep, not partial sleep. It needs rest, right? Your body needs good food. It needs exercise. It needs to be mitigated away from chemical exposures as much as possible. So things like tobacco and alcohol on frequent basis use, those things are contributed to cancer. The chemicals, and I would argue even with tobacco, I would say tobacco is probably a lot less unhealthy than what we've been told. And one of the bigger problems with tobacco today and big tobacco is that it's loaded with chemicals. It's loaded with manipulative chemicals and pesticides. And so, we've got cultures like blue zones. If you guys don't know what blue zones are, they're areas across the world that have been researched for longevity, meaning these are cultures that generally have the highest percentage of population of people that live to be 100 plus. And so many of the people that live in blue zones actually smoke, right? But they're not getting the exposure to the chemically loaded, genetically modified tobacco. So many of the things that we're currently being exposed to. So now, this is not me advertising to you that tobacco is okay just buy it organically. I still think it's a bad idea. However, these are mitigating risk factors that we can control, and if we choose to control them, we can reduce our risk dramatically. Half of all cancers could be prevented. So you have to understand that with cancer, it's not, you don't wait till you get cancer and treat it. It's about prevention. The key word here, it's about prevention. It's not about treatment. By the time you already have the cancer and it's time to treat it, you've already got a major, major problem on your hands and a major, major battle. And that battle, I can speak from personal experience with this, that battle is more than just, hey, I need to eat right and exercise. You're not just battling what you have been doing in your diet and lifestyle. You're battling a complete social paradigm. You're battling doctors scaring you. You're battling your own family members trying to coerce you into doing things not naturally, but chemically and artificially. Like, there's so many different elements of what you're actually going to battle when dealing with cancer. And so all that warring, all that internal battle, all that strife creates a huge degree of stress. Again, stress being one of those lifestyle components that contributes to the increased risk of cancer. So, my advice to you is prevention is where it's at. Prevention is why we eat right. It's why we sleep. It's why we exercise. It's why we get sunshine. It's why we surround ourselves with loving, caring, concerned people who have our best interests in mind. It's why we avoid, I'll say the proverbial life vampires that we all have in our lives sometimes that we're exposed to. That's prevention. It's about taking care of yourself and not waiting for the illness to coerce you into prompting action to take care of yourself. It's why many of you are listening to the show, right? As you're trying to figure out better ways to take care of yourself as opposed to necessarily coming back from illness or disease. So next, I want to talk a little bit about what we're looking at here So I focus so far mostly on gluten, but now I want to turn and I want to look a little bit about how grains contribute to cancer, because gluten is one way, and I've shown you the evidence. Like, there's enough overwhelming, compelling evidence that shows that people with late in life diagnosis for gluten sensitivity have higher risk of developing multiple forms of cancer, and people that don't follow a gluten-free diet that should be actually have much greater varieties of a number of different forms of cancer. So we know gluten can do it. And any of you who doubt that, I'm going to put a link up here in just a minute. I'll show you how you can access it. If you're still doubting, please go read the research. Don't even necessarily take my word for it. Go read the research, take it to your doctor, have a conversation, but get real about it and quit living with your head in the sand in denial. But let's talk about grains. So, this is one of the big arguments that people come to me with. Dr. Osborne, no grain, no pain, that's ridiculous. I understand gluten, but grain is good for you. Whole grains are healthy. And so what I want to talk a little bit about today, some of the things that are in whole grains, and I'm going to skip down here. So one of the factors in whole grain is pesticide. Now, some would argue, okay, I understand that pesticides are not good for us. We know that there are a number of different pesticides that can contribute to an increased risk of cancer, especially many of you that followed the lawsuit that came out earlier last year out of San Francisco, where the company that produces Roundup was sued in a court and lost because it was proven that Roundup not only causes lymphoma or cancer, but Roundup, but they were found guilty of hiding evidence that proved that it did. So we know pesticides contribute to it. So many of you are saying, okay, well, I'm going to buy my bread and my grains organically. Okay, you can do that too. So if that's your argument, then we have to have a conversation around molds and around mycotoxins. Now, why is that? Because in the United States, molds and mycotoxins contaminate much of the grain that you're consuming. Mold and mycotoxins are a massive grain contaminant, and we know this because in animals, it's a very, very big problem. We see a lot of animals getting sick over mold and mycotoxins, but we also see, especially in the gluten-free food industry, many of you, if you're new to the show and you haven't read No Grain, No Pain, first of all, I highly recommend that you do, because the reason why I didn't call the book No Gluten, No Pain is because it's not just gluten. It's about the properties of grain creating and wreaking inflammatory damage on individuals. So people that buy the gluten-free products, those are the products that, like your corn and your rice-based products, when we analyze them, what do we find? We find that they're high in mold and mycotoxins. Specifically, corn is high in a type of mycotoxin that is a known carcinogen. So we know that these products have a lot of mold and mycotoxins, but we also know that even if it's not packaged food, even if it's not processed food, we know that organic grain is also contaminated with molds and mycotoxins. Now, I'm going to open up a new window here for you. We're going to go online to Gluten Free Society here. And let's see here. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to pull this up for you because I want to show you. So again, those of you who are new to the show, if you haven't been to glutenfreesociety.org, it's our foundation where we talk about the gluten-free lifestyle, but even deeper than that. So what I want to show you, this article is here for you, by the way. So if you want to go read any of the research about what I'm talking tonight, you can come pull up this article in our blog, and you can pull up all these different studies. Everything you see highlighted blue here is linking to research studies that make the correlation between everything I'm talking about tonight and its contribution to cancer. But where I'm going with this, let's back up just a minute here. I skipped right by it. Okay. Here we go. We're coming into it now. So mycotoxins. So what I wanted to show you, okay, is we're looking at here 5 common categories of mycotoxins found in grains. So we got these 5 categories, but going even deeper, what I want to show you is this particular one right here, fumonisn B1, is mostly found on corn, and it's a carcinogen. It's actually classified as a group 1 carcinogen. So what this means it's not a carcinogen in animal studies. It's a carcinogen based on human trials, on human evidence. Again, if you want to go learn more about that, all you have to do is click that link, and it's going to pull up that study for you directly. So you can see here contaminants in grain, a major risk for whole grain safety. Again, this is why am I pulling this up? Why are we talking about this? Because so many people believe or have this kind of fundamental belief that whole grains are somehow free of any type of caustic ingredient or contaminant or problem. And the reality is that whole grains can actually be highly contaminated with mycotoxins that can actually increase your risk for the development of a number of different forms of cancer. So we've got, one of those factors being, again, molds and mycotoxins, but that's not all. I also want to talk about some of the other factors associated with increased risk. And so one of the things that we see, and this is especially true as well, is the increased, let's get out of here, the increased quantity of carbohydrates in the diet. So many people that consume or that overconsume excessive carbohydrates, one of the fundamental truths that we know about cancer is it feeds primarily on carbohydrate. And so, many people will say, yeah, but whole grains have fiber in them, so that's not super high carb. But we have to understand that there are compounds, for example, in wheat, there's a sugar called amylopectin. It's far more glycemic than what you're going to find with pure glucose. So wheat is actually going to drive up carbs and insulin and increase your risk for the development of diabetes and subsequently feed potential cancer cells far greater than sugar will. So excessive carbohydrates are one of the other reasons why we can see whole grains contributing to cancer. Now, does that mean if you had whole grain, if you're not gluten sensitive and you're buying all of your grain organically, does that mean that you're still at an increased risk if you have an occasional whole grain in your diet? Not so much, outside of the fact, okay, that some of our grains are also contaminated with toxic metals. The big metals that we'll see with grain include arsenic, we'll see cadmium, we see lead, and we also see mercury. Mercury can be found particularly in corn. Lead is contaminating some of your rice. Cadmium can contaminate rice. Arsenic can contaminate rice. So we know, again, if you're following that whole gluten-free grain component, know that you're increasing your risk for the development of heavy metals. As a matter of fact, some research shows that people that gravitate toward these heavy rice-based gluten-free diets actually have higher levels of measurable carcinogenic toxic metals. Now understand that all of these right here, so every one of these increases the risk for the development of cancer. These are carcinogens, and it's important that you understand that. So again, it doesn't matter that you're eating an organic grain. These are still there. These are pulled out of the soil. These are extracted from the soil. Grain's really good at accumulating and storing these particular elements. So, again, going back to, even if you're not gluten sensitive and you're eating things organically, you still run a greater risk of getting heavy metal contamination. You still run a risk of mold and mycotoxin contamination as well. Now, the other thing I would add, and let's go ahead and switch because we're running out of room here. Let's blow this up. The other thing I would add is one of the things that also happens is this nutritional deficiency issue. Now, a lot of people don't know this history about the United States, but in the year 1943, grain sales were actually prohibited in the U.S. So this is U.S. history. Why? Why were grain sales inhibited in the United States? Because grain was responsible for approximately 8,000 deaths. And this is grain not related to gluten or gluten sensitivity, but it's grain related to malnutrition. So 8,000 deaths annually. So per year, grain was responsible for killing about 8,000 people a year. How was it doing that? It was doing that through a disease called beriberi, and it was also doing that through a disease called pellagra. So if you've ever heard of vitamin B1 or niacin, vitamin B3, these are B vitamin deficiency diseases that can kill you. if you become too deficient. And what was happening was grain itself was creating deficiencies that were so great that it was leading to deaths through beriberi and pellagra. So what the government did is they sold, or they banned the sale of grains unless, this is where fortification came in. So, most of you aren't old enough. I wasn't old enough, right? I wasn't born before 1943, or I wasn't cognizant in 1943 to understand these things. But fortification actually came from the fact that grain was responsible for causing malnutrition to the level that it was creating as many as 8,000 deaths per year. And so this is when you saw on those food labels, this is why they began fortifying with B1, with B3. Okay, they began fortifying with iron. They began fortifying with major nutrients. So when you flip over and you look at an ingredients or a supplement facts panel, nutritional facts box, you're always going to see, no matter what the grain product is, if it comes in a package or a wrapper, by law, it cannot be sold unless it's fortified with synthetic vitamins and minerals. And so what the food manufacturers did, they got really smart. The cereal manufacturers and the bread companies, they didn't say, hey, don't eat us because we're going to kill you, causing you to have malnutrition. What they said instead is, hey, now we're fortified, so we're even better for you. So now make cereal and bread a daily part of your essential meal or your breakfast, right? And so the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is this came on the heels of the Great Depression. And so one of the other things that happened during the Great Depression is we had subsidies. So grain subsidies, so in essence, your tax dollars were taken from you to feed the farmer's back pocket. And this was done to prevent farmers from going out of business and creating a massive food shortage in the United States during the Great Depression. I don't argue that. I think it was an okay thing to do. I think you've got to keep the farmers growing food or we're going to starve to death. However, these subsidies still exist today. And we're not, arguably, well, we may be going through a Great Depression here pretty soon, but we're not currently going through a Great Depression in that regard. So you have to understand, today, who are the farmers? Now, there are still small company farmers. Definitely that still exists. I won't deny the existence of that. But the vast majority of your farmers are corps and corporations. And if you look at the interlocking relationship between Big Pharma, so we have Big Pharma, we have Big Food, and we also have, unfortunately, Big Government. And so what happens is Big Food takes your tax dollars to grow genetically modified processed grains and sell them back to you, okay? And it comes with gluten and processed additives, excessive carbohydrates, nutritional deficiencies, and overcoming that, we're adding synthetic vitamins instead of real vitamins. Gluten comes with an increased risk of infection. There's a lot of evidence that shows that people with gluten sensitivity issues have much greater risks of developing infections that can trigger cancer, which is what we've been talking about. It comes with molds and mycotoxins. It comes with toxic metals, and it comes with pesticides. And I would argue that all these things are really designed to kill most people, right? If we were trying to slowly and insidiously poison millions of people, this would be like the perfect plan that no one would suspect because nobody's going to eat a piece of bread and die tomorrow. That's just not the way it works. It's a slow poison. But we've got Big Food. This is what they're growing. This is what they're producing. And they're taking your money to do it. So they're taking your money through subsidies to poison you. And then you have more subsidies because your tax dollars now also go, because Big Government takes your money. Now they mandate that you have to have health insurance, and so that's a form of taxation. And that health insurance, what does it cover? It covers drug-based treatment. So it covers drug treatments. Okay, so what is drug treatments? That's Big Pharma, folks. And so now you've got a government that takes your tax dollars to grow your food that's actually poison. You've got a government that, basically says you have to have insurance and that the insurance will cover drug therapy. And the drug therapy is the other set of corporations called Big Pharma, which produce the vast majority of drugs. And if we look at, what did I say a moment ago? I didn't put this slide. I wish I would have put this slide in here for you. But if we look at number 1, number 2, and number 3, causes of death in the United States. We could argue heart disease. We could argue cancer. And we could, like I said earlier, they kind of can swap places between 1 and 2. But the third leading cause of death in the United States is pharma. And I'm not talking about accidental overdose here, folks. I'm talking about properly prescribed meds. Properly done, not doctors making mistakes, not, oops, I gave you too much of a dose. I'm talking about properly prescribed medications. Recent study published in the British Medical Journal found that properly prescribed medications were responsible for almost 250,000, and some would estimate even higher, 250,000 deaths a year, making it the third leading cause of death in the United States. So let that sink in for a minute. Let that sink in. Your food is grown by big corporations that are connected to the same companies that feed, when the food makes you sick, these same companies take your tax dollars to feed you drugs to treat what? What are you treating? This is where it really gets interesting, because pharma is the way that we treat heart disease, and it's the way that we treat cancer. So the way we treat number 1 and 2 leads to number 3. If that's the scenario that you desire for yourself and your family, by all means, keep doing what you're doing. But if you want a different solution, you want a different scenario, and I highly employ you to take a greater look at this. Again, it's not just about gluten. Many of you have come to me and said, Dr. Osborne, what about glyphosate? Is it the glyphosate? Has gluten always been an issue? Look, gluten has always been an issue. The oldest known case of gluten sensitivity dates back 2,000 years BC. We know gluten has been a problem. Has gluten been the big problem? Has it been as big a problem as we see it today? Yes and no. I would argue probably not. I would say when you add pesticides and toxic metals and mold and mycotoxins, when you add poor nutritional density, when you add a diet of excessive carbohydrates, and you take all these grains and you, for the most part, you put in a bunch of food additives and other chemicals like meat glue, and you process it, none of these things have anything to do with gluten. But gluten-induced inflammation is a very real problem. So let's not just ignore that either. But we have to look at these other components, because these other components, which are not necessarily directly gluten-related, but are just inherent properties of grain, which you have to understand, why is it that everybody says grain is such a staff of life or a staple food? Most cultures didn't consume the level of grain that we in the United States or in industrialized countries consume, nowhere near the level of quantity. And so we're seeing gluten sensitivity increase in part because of the quantity. Look at the sizes and the servings and the portions of food as it's served in restaurants today. Look at the size of people in the United States today. Like if you look at general statistics, 50% of the United States is overweight, 40% is obese, morbidly so. And this was not always the case. So I think we can make the argument, and part of it, that since grain was subsidized and we've made it the base of the food guide pyramid. Now the food guide pyramid is changing, which is, I'll give them credit for at least making the change, but for years, for decades, the base of the food guide pyramid was 8+ servings of grain, right? Which comes with all these properties. Why? Because the government was taking your tax dollars to pay big corporations to grow slow poisons for you, and that was feeding the system. Again, now big pharma can come in and rescue you from yourself, right? And unfortunately, when that happens, when you eat grain to the level of heart disease development, to the level of cancer development, you now gravitate toward treating those problems. Both of these problems, vast majority of them are caused by lifestyle issues. And now we're going to treat it with an artificial chemical. So this is artificial manipulation. Of your chemistry, and what this does is it doesn't really treat the disease itself. It treats what doctors call risk factors. If you have, for example, with heart disease, if you have high blood pressure, they give you a drug to lower your blood pressure, but they don't ask why your blood pressure is high. Most people develop high blood pressure because they have low oxygen, and they have low oxygen because they're malnourished. and because their red blood cells are struggling to perform and struggling to do their job, so they can't deliver adequate oxygen. So blood pressure naturally goes up because the body is saying the brain's not getting enough oxygen. Increase the pressure to get more oxygen to the brain. So what doctors do instead is they diagnose you with high blood pressure. They control artificially the risk factor of high blood pressure, and in so doing, create other risk factors. So new risk factors are then created. For example, if you're taking a blood pressure medication, one of the side effects of the vast majority of blood pressure medications is it reduces vitamin B1, and it also reduces something called coenzyme Q10. Well, vitamin B1 deficiency causes beriberi, which is a form of congestive heart failure. CoQ10 deficiency causes high blood pressure and congestive heart failure. So again, you're medicating the problem, creating new risk factors that are nutritional in relationship, and doctors are happy to do it, not necessarily that they're happy to hurt you, because I don't think any doctor is intentionally trying to hurt you, but they're happy to do it because they believe in their heart of hearts that controlling risk factors through chemical manipulation is an answer. And the reason they believe that is because there's virtually no nutritional training. And when you don't understand this stuff, how can you be held accountable to the patients that you're treating? And the answer is you really can't be, but that's why it's up to you. It's up to you as the consumer, as the intelligent, smart consumer who cares about yourself enough to ask questions, right? To pick and choose your doctor with scrutiny and with discernment, and not just to give over all of your control and all of your power, right, to somebody who's going to hand you an artificial solution to modify your risk factors that end up creating new risk factors that end up contributing to more of the same disease that you're being treated for. And this is the pattern that we see repetitively. And this, again, one of the reasons why we see this repetitive pattern is because for most Americans, actually for most people in industrialized countries, this right here, grain, represents 60 to 80% of the total caloric intake of your total calories in a day, right? When you're eating, some type of muffin or some type of wrap or some type of cereal or donut or kolache or pastry for breakfast, and you couple that with pizza or a sandwich or a hamburger or a hot dog or something along those lines for your lunch, and then at dinner, again, it's more of the same. Again, the vast majority of the calories coming from grain-based calories, and grain comes with all of these things, and all of these things are known to contribute to cancer. And cancer, again, is the second most common cause of death in the United States. So going back to what I said earlier, which is all cancers, if we look at life, it's lifestyle. Half of all cancers, and some speculate even more, I gave you very conservative statistics tonight, are modifiable by diet change and by lifestyle change. Well, this is the ultimate in diet change. This is why, again, why we're having this conversation tonight. So that being said, I do want to talk a little bit more in depth about this component here, this nutritional deficiency component, because one of the things that we know, particularly if you are gluten sensitive, so if you have a gluten sensitivity issue, one of the problems that comes with that is malabsorption. And when I say malabsorption, we're talking about nutrients. Well, do nutrients play a role in cancer? They sure do. Vitamin D, iron, B vitamins. For example, we know folate deficiency is a contributing factor to human papillomavirus, which is also a contributing factor to what many young ladies now are getting a vaccine for. If you've heard of the Gardasil vaccine for again HPV, why are doctors recommending the vaccine? Because that virus contributes to cancer, but it's B vitamins, okay, that are known to help your body defend itself and to keep itself healthy from those viral replications, creating what's called dysplastic tissue in the cervix, which predominantly in females is where this occurs. So cervical cancer is linked to that. So we know B vitamins contribute to cancer, or I should say B vitamin deficiencies contribute to cancer, but then we also know that other nutrients like magnesium and calcium and zinc, we know they all contribute to cancer. Now, because of the time constraints that we have, again, I'm going to show you, let's see, let's pull it up for you. I'm going to show you, because I want you to be able to go back and read this in depth. We don't have time to cover everything in it tonight, but I've put it together for you because I wanted you to have this as a resource, because I know, again, many of you are going to battle this. 40% of you in your lifetime, you're going to develop a potential issue or diagnosis of cancer, and you want to be armed now. Get armed now and be able to take action now so that you can prevent the issue. So going back to the gluten causes nutritional deficiencies, okay? And so what I've done here is I've kind of highlighted some of the big ones where we know the big players that really play a major role in the development of cancer. Zinc, for example, we know zinc is an antioxidant. We know it stabilizes your DNA. We know that stabilized DNA has less of a tendency to develop into cancer cells. We know that studies have shown that zinc stops the growth of tumor cells. We know that iron is associated with cancers of the stomach. What did we say earlier about gluten, also associated with cancers of the stomach? We know that vitamin B6 deficiency plays a major role in an increased risk of cancer. Human studies shown that higher vitamin B6 levels are associated with a 30 to 50% reduction in the risk of developing colon cancer. We know that vitamin D, I said earlier, vitamin D plays a role in 19 different forms of cancer. We know that vitamin D deficiency, just solving that one problem in the U.S. alone, it's estimated would battle a number of cancers far better than chemo and radiation therapy over the long haul. In essence, people that didn't become vitamin D deficient over time would have a less of a tendency to develop cancer. We know that selenium deficiency, there's evidence that shows that selenium deficiency can cause cancers. That we know that, so we'll stop there. So again, vitamin and mineral deficiencies play a big role because, again, these vitamins and minerals are how your body fight cancer cells. We know that calorically, the carbohydrate content of grains and the way that people consume them is far too great for the body, and so it can contribute to increased risk of cancer. We know that the processed food additives like meat glue and MSG and food dyes and food preservatives and other chemicals, we know those can increase the risk. Many of them can increase the risk for developing cancers. We know that pesticides can increase that risk. We know that toxic metals can increase that risk. We know that molds and mycotoxins and increased infections can all increase the risk of the development of cancer. And we know that not just gluten, but gluten and grains are packaged all together, in my opinion, as one of the world's perfect poisons. Why? Because cancer doesn't happen. You don't wake up one day with cancer. It's a slow, progressive, insidious disease that builds slowly with time. And so if you're aware of that, you can take action to mitigate your risk, reduce your risk, and potentially offset a major catastrophe in your life. So that being said, let's open it up for questions. Okay. Somebody's asking, Nora wants to know about einkorn flour. So einkorn, so that's another, I'm glad you bring that up, because einkorn is what people refer to as an ancient grain. It's one that's been less hybridized over time. Understand that einkorn contains gluten. Einkorn contains molds. Okay, einkorn can pull toxic metals from the soil. And depending on how you're eating it, einkorn is oftentimes got processed or additives in it. So is my opinion on einkorn really any better than it would be with any other form of grain? Not really. It's kind of a trap people fall into. They think, oh, it's a whole grain, it's an ancient grain, therefore it's somehow better and somehow less toxic. You don't want to fall into that trap. Let's see here. Let's see, scroll down for me. There you go. If your calcium levels are optimal yet still suffering from the conditions associated with calcium deficiency, what's a safe daily dose of calcium supplement to take? Look at, I would say if your calcium levels are okay and you are experiencing the symptoms of calcium deficiency, understand that there's a lot of overlap with mineral deficiencies, and it may not be calcium, so I don't really recommend taking a bunch of extra calcium. If you've had your calcium levels measured as normal, don't take more calcium just for the sake of the symptoms that you are having. Yeah, so Deandra, it's true. We know that glyphosate can cause lymphoma, but we also know that gluten can cause lymphoma, and we have evidence of gluten-induced lymphoma even before the wide-scale or broad-spectrum use of glyphosate-contaminated grains. So that being said, I think it's a 1-2 punch. I think it is the glyphosate, certainly, beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I also think it's the gluten found in the grain, and I think when you mix the two together, you get an even stronger outcome of potential for lymphoma. Ezekiel bread. Somebody's asking about Ezekiel bread. No, it's not gluten-free. First of all, Ezekiel bread is full of gluten. I argue that it actually has more gluten. Sprouted grains tend to have more gluten than non-sprouted grain. So if you're gluten sensitive, it's a terrible idea. Let's see here. Cancer or the cure for cancer that kills. No, that's not a question. I think that's more of a comment. Yeah, so a lot of you chiming in, no nutrition, meaning I asked that question earlier, and if your doctors had any kind of conversation. Let's see here. Is fonio a bad grain? Yes, don't recommend that. Do you think we still have pellagra in this day and age from people eating too much wheat? But if it's not called that, it's called eczema or other things that most doctors diagnose differently. I would argue that, yes, that's probably pretty true. I've seen cases of eczema and skin inflammatory disease clear as a result of diet change, as a result of supplementation with B vitamins. I would argue that doctors are so unversed and untrained on nutrition that generally they diagnose eczema as a kind of a generic skin inflammation, and the predictable prescription for that is a steroid, oftentimes a steroid cream, which doesn't really solve the problem. It just hides the inflammation. Amaranth, somebody's asking about amaranth and oats. Amaranth is a pseudo grain, so technically it's not a grain. The problem with amaranth is cross-contamination. If you are gluten sensitive, amaranth is, a lot of the products that are amaranth-based are cross-contaminated. There was a study done, I want to say it was about 10 years ago, that showed pulling those products off the grocery store counter found that about 42% of them were actually cross-contaminated with enough gluten. And I think it's because they're processed in similar facilities. And so a lot of cross-contamination of gluten can occur in pseudograins. So amaranth, buckwheat, and quinoa are all pseudograins. Now, I don't recommend amaranth because its protein properties are so similar to gluten that we'll see a lot of people with cross-reactivity with pseudograins, especially, and quinoa is one especially that's been studied and shown to cause inflammation in people trying to follow a gluten-free diet. So I don't recommend the pseudograins either. In oats, the oats are not gluten-free. Oats, the name of the gluten in oats is called avenin, and it's been shown in a number of research studies to cause inflammatory damage for those who are gluten sensitive. Nancy wants to know, is there a flour substitute you can recommend I cannot order from the United States? If you're talking about a grain-free flour, Nancy, go check out. We've got a really good article on flours. I mean, there's green banana flour, there's chestnut flour, tapioca, arrowroot, and a number of other different types of starchy flours that can be used. I would say don't get in the habit of using these as a staple food in your diet, but if you're going to use them to do the occasional baking or something along those lines, that would be perfectly fine. But where people run into problems with a lot of these flours, the coconut flours, the almond flours, well, the almond flours are high in oxalate, so if you're oxalate sensitive, that could be a problem for you. And if you're not oxalate sensitive, it's okay. But people do run into trouble with some of these other flours, not from the perspective of they're allergic to them, but from the perspective of they're over-consuming them, and so it's causing major shifts in their diet. Remember that less is more sometimes when it comes to a lot of these. Somebody's chiming in about tiger nut flour, which is a good baking substitute. It's a tuber. Tiger nut is actually a tuber. Has kind of a granular taste, a nutty kind of granular taste, but it does a pretty good job as a substitute. Sharon asks, what's the average amount of carbs on a given day? Depends on the person. So let's look at it from this perspective. Let me draw you. So if you're following just a standard, first of all, it depends on how much you eat in a day. So like we take the average person who's about 5'4" to 5'6". Again, this is a very rough estimation, folks. It's different for different people, but approximately 1,500 calories a day. So you're asking about percentages or quantity of carbohydrate. What is it that we're shooting for? So we're shooting for 1/3 of that 1,500 coming from carbs, 1/3 coming from fat, and 1/3 coming from protein. That's balance, right? We're looking for inequality in macronutrients in our total caloric intake. Now, that doesn't mean you have to get out a scale and a measurement device and measure everything every single day, but you're shooting for kind of the law of averages. Now, if you eat seasonally, and you eat what's in season as it comes into season, you'll be closer to this than if you just eat whatever you want at any given time of the day, because what happens to most people is they gravitate toward sweet, and so they tend to overconsume the carbohydrate. They're hitting that instead of getting 1/3, which would be about 500 calories, right? So 500 calories coming from carbohydrate. If you divide that by 4, what you're left with is about, well, I'm not going to do the math exact. So you divide that by 4. What do we got? We got 1, 10, we got 2, we got 2 left over. We got about 125 calories a day, or rather 125 grams, of carbohydrate a day is equivalent to 500 calories a day. Now, many of you following keto would be like, wow, that's way too many. I'm trying to stay under 20 grams of carbs a day. There are times to go keto and there are times to not go keto. And I would argue that many people that go keto can actually start to create problems in the direction of keto for too long. Not everyone. Some people do better on keto. Some people have a metabolism that burns better through keto. But I would argue you're not after low carb or low protein or low fat. Like, if we've ever learned anything from history, it's when we do low carb, low protein, low fat for prolonged periods of time is when we start to see the problems start to crop up, which is why I'm a bigger fan of balance. You can do bursts of low carb or bursts of lower protein, etc. But over time, you want to come back to balance. It's that balance that's going to give you kind of a greater overall resiliency at how your body's capable of burning macronutrients for calories and energy. And you want your body to be able to utilize carbs, fats, and proteins kind of equally. Some people refer to that as kind of metabolic resiliency, meaning your body can shift from fat burning mode to carbohydrate burning mode relatively easily. So you have a resiliency in your ability to generate energy from calories. Okay. Can food manufacturers process and separate the gluten protein from the remaining grain product? No, it's inherent to the grain itself. You're not really going to, you can make, some are trying to do low gluten products, but here's the problem with that. Again, just like we can learn about history about low carb, low fat, low protein diets creating over time, creating problems and imbalances for people, what else do we know? Every time you introduced a highly processed food, usually it leads to illness. It leads to disease. I would say that those that are trying to produce ultra low gluten based products, as opposed to just naturally trying to eat gluten free, you're in for a problem, just maybe in a different way. Just like if you remember, well, maybe you don't remember, you might maybe remember reading about this in history, but in 1910 when margarine was introduced as a butter substitute, everybody was told it was better, it was healthier, and that we were going to reduce heart disease. And what actually ended up happening is we found out, and recently many states and cities have banned the sale of margarine because of its detriment, because of its danger to cancer and heart disease and other health issues. But, it's a highly processed food. We saw the same thing happen with artificial sweeteners. Artificial sweeteners like aspartame and NutraSweet and Splenda. You know, when they're introduced, they're called health foods. But as time goes on, what we actually learn through the human experiment, you guys being the human experiment, if you take part in this charade, is you become the illness that occurs as a result of the exposure of the highly processed nonsense that people are trying to pander to you. So it's always best to wait when something new comes out, it's a new ingredient or a new product. It's always best to wait 10 years and let everyone else be the guinea pig. And then, you know, if there's enough compelling scientific evidence that says that something that's highly processed isn't dangerous, then maybe you might look at it a little bit more seriously if you even wanted to at that point as a potential for variety in your diet. But again, I don't think we can recall one time where that's ever happened in the history of food processing. So I'm not going to hold my breath and wait for that to become a reality. Let's see, what's the average amount of carbs? I think I answered that one. Do all potatoes contain oxalate? Yes, they do. That includes sweet potatoes. So if you're following a low oxalate diet, you know, and I will reiterate, not everybody that's following a gluten-free diet needs to follow a low oxalate diet. A lot of people got overwhelmed when I talked about that last week and you thought, oh my gosh, we have to restrict even more things. No, you have to restrict oxalates if you're oxalate sensitive, but if you're not, don't necessarily add that to your gluten-free diet as a restriction. Let's see here. Does gluten shrink the brain? Yeah, as a matter of fact, there have been a number of studies. Dr. Mario Hadjivassiliou out of Oxford has done a number of studies on gluten and the neurological system, including on the brain, and on how select areas of the brain actually shrink over long gluten exposures. And so, yes, to answer your question in the simplest of ways, does gluten shrink your brain? Does it make you dumber? Yes. I mean, just look at our culture, right? And this is no offense to anybody, but maybe it is an offense to many of you. What we see is cognitive decline, right? As a culture, we see cognitive decline across a number of measuring points. We see IQ and intelligence quotients basically dropping as a result of the food and the diet. And we see the opposite happen when food is reversed. And we see this in schoolhouses. A number of research studies show that when you get the garbage out of the school cafeteria, then the children do better and they have less disciplinary problems within the school. So we know that the food can actually make a person literally stupid. It can make them dumber, especially if it's the wrong food. Let's see, are nodules in the kidneys and the thyroid cancers? No, they're nodules. And so, you know, the only way you can really differentiate a nodule from an actual, so like a benign nodule from a malignant tumor, the only way in kind of traditional medicine to do that is you can look at it in imaging and you look at the margins around the tumor, around the nodule. And generally speaking, if the nodules are irregular, that's a sign of the tumor being more malignant. If the nodules, generally they have to be biopsied to get a formal diagnosis. The problem with a biopsy of a tumor or nodule is that if it is a malignant nodule, remember the whole premise of a tumor is that it's your body's immune system has sequestered off these very dangerous abnormal cells. So to puncture that with a needle, you basically run the risk of increasing metastasis to other organs and other tissues in your body, which is one of the fundamental, in my opinion, one of the fundamental flaws, if you will, in mainstream diagnosis, is that in order to get the diagnosis, you run the risk of actually exacerbating the potential for metastasis of the cancer. So again, a lot of doctors focus on that diagnosis. What is the cancer? What exactly do we call the tumor? What exact kind of cancer is it, so that they can manipulate the different chemotherapies or radiation therapies, etc. But I would argue that, you know, that your body put that tumor there, your body can take it away. And if you do things right, you get your diet and your lifestyle dialed in. And I've seen this happen in a number of cases where people's tumors were able to actually dissipate and go away with the right diet and lifestyle. Let's see. A good multivitamin. Several of you are asking that. So what I would recommend, if you're just looking for the best gluten-free multivitamin, Ultra Nutrients is what you want. Ultra Nutrients, we can go back and I can kind of show you where you can find that. But ultra nutrients, and the reason why, because I have several different formulations. One of them is stronger. It's called multi-nutrients, but it's stronger. And if you're just looking for a baseline multivitamin, you just go to Gluten Free Society here and you hit that shop button and you can just type in that search box. You can just type in ultra nutrients and it should pull it up for you, and you can read all about it and learn a little bit more about it. But that's what I would recommend. That's just a baseline. Might help if I put it in there right for you. So it'll pull it up for you, and you can, again, you can read all about it here. But this is really designed to be hypoallergenic. So there's definitely no grain, there's no gluten in it, but it's very well tolerated by a lot of people that don't do well with multivitamins. Like they've got a history of trying different brands and it upsets their stomach or it creates problems for them. So if you want in my opinion, you want the best one, that's it. It's one I personally designed, and I designed it for that reason. I designed it to cover your bases if you're gluten sensitive, to help basically support your nutrition and your recovery from years of gluten-induced damage and malnutrition. Let's see here. Do I recommend 6 small meals a day? No, not really. I think the whole premise of 6 small meals a day came out of the bodybuilding world as a myth to weight loss. Meaning, if you ate 6 small meals a day, you'd stoke the fires of your metabolism to always be on and always be burning, and you'd somehow burn more calories. And there's no scientific merit behind 6 small meals a day. There's actually more scientific merit behind intermittent fasting, and that would be keeping a more narrow window of eating. I like to do intermittent fasting personally. I do a 16-hour fast every day, so all my meals generally fall within the same 8-hour window. And that's an effective way to give your GI tract rest. But if you're constantly hammering your gut with food and your gut's leaking and you're trying to recover, 6 small meals a day is a horrible idea. Let's see. Tapioca starch. Somebody wants to know about tapioca starch. Not as a staple in your diet. If you use it occasionally, it's okay as a baking agent or ingredient. But again, I wouldn't recommend it as an everyday food. Chia seeds, same thing. I would not recommend them as an everyday food. Any kind of seed-based food as a regular everyday food, if you're struggling with gut problems, can create kind of a delayance of your recovery. Let's see. How do you know if you're oxalate sensitive? Well, that's really simple. Just have an oxalate test done. There's a urinary oxalate test that can help you measure whether or not you have excessive oxalate or inability to break them down. Get with your doc about that as a standard to get that type of testing done. Chris wants to know if I could speak a little on vitamin D. Yeah, Chris, I made a pretty long video. It's a vitamin D crash course you can access. It's on our YouTube channel. Those of you who don't subscribe already, I'd highly recommend that you check it out. You can visit us online at you can visit us online at glutenfreesociety.org. And so if you go to the home page here, you can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out a couple of times a week with information and new videos and everything else. But all you have to do that is come right down here in the middle. It says subscribe to the #1 gluten-free newsletter. Just put in your name. Make sure you select what you're interested in, because what we really try to do is we try to tailor our information to what your needs are. So the more you can be thorough with us, the more we try to tailor our information to better serve you. So select what you're interested in, and make sure you hit that submit button, so that we can make sure we send you things like video updates. If you want to check out our video library, you can just click that big tab right there on the video library. And so some of you are asking, is the show being recorded? It absolutely is being recorded. Will we put a replay up? Yes. So like last week's show on oxalates, again, all you have to do is go into our video library, and you can pull up there probably 800 videos in there at this point, where if you want to watch anything that you want to watch, let's pause that here.
As well.
There we go. So if you want to watch any of the past shows, you can get access to that information. Again, now if you want to get make sure you don't ever miss information, one of the things that I'd highly recommend that you do is also, so sign up for our newsletter there, but also go over to youtube.com/glutenology. And if you come visit us there, I spelt it. Looks like I missed a Y here. Let's put that Y in for you. We'll just pull it up right here. So come visit us, youtube.com/glutenology. And then when you get there, the big thing here is just hit that big red button, that subscribe button. And once you hit that, there will be a little bell icon that appears. And that bell, once you subscribe, hit the bell. And what that does is it allows for you to get a notification anytime we upload a new video, because we're doing anywhere from 5 to 7 new videos every week for you. And so again, the job here, what we're trying to accomplish is we're trying to help as many people as we can through our outreach and through our education. So you guys have been following me any length of time. What we're trying to do is save 100 million lives, and the way we're doing that is through our outreach. And so this information is all free to you. There's no cost, there's no charge. I don't charge a membership fee. And what you probably get from 1/10 of the videos that we've published is more than what you might find in the entire internet in the natural health and the natural wellness field. And most of our videos and our topics are very, very robust, and they're covered in great detail. So if you're kind of a scientific nerd and geek and you want the references and the resources, you can even tap into that information, because we produce that for you here every week. So, okay, I think we're out of time, folks. We ran a little over tonight, but ran a little bit over to help you out. So, look, if you like the show, make sure you give us some love. Hit the like button, hit the love button. The more you like it, the more you share it, the more social media shares it for us. And again, if we're going to help reach 100 million people, I need your help in doing that. So if you appreciate me, let me know that by sharing this information. Let me know that by hitting that thumbs up button and that love button. Let Facebook know in their algorithm to get this thing out there and shared. So again, the more love you send us, the more love Facebook sends this to more people. So help us out. We appreciate you. Hope you have a fantastic week. We'll see you next Monday night for another episode of Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Take care. Hey, don't forget to tune in next week, same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, for another Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain show. Bring all your toughest health questions to me. I look forward to answering them. And before you leave today, make sure you hit subscribe. And once you do, click that bell. That bell is going to allow us to remind you right before we go live. But it's also going to allow us to remind you when we come out with other video content all week long. We've got lots of episodes coming your way all week long, and I don't want you to miss anything. So again, subscribe, hit that bell so that you can get notified when we have that new information put up for you. Thanks so much, and I'm wishing you excellent health. Have a great week. We'll see you next Monday night.